Acho que o som já está e, em primeiro lugar, queria desejar a todos muito boa noite, agradecer a vossa presença aqui na Casa da Arquitetura. Queria, obviamente, agradecer também o convite que me foi formulado para estar aqui entre tão distintos convidados, que representam 5 grandes instituições ligadas à arte e à arquitetura. Ali na pessoa do arquiteto Nuno Sampaio, os meus agradecimentos. Como sabem, esta mesa tem por título Arquitetura no Palco, com um pressuposto, e foram lançados 2 temas de debate que lá iremos, e eu proporia que cada uma das pessoas aqui presentes fizesse uma pequena apresentação, que eu creio que foi exatamente isso que lhes disseram, uma pequena apresentação. Vamos por ordem cronológica das instituições, ou seja, o Victorian Albert Museum e a Olivia, desde que está ali à minha esquerda até à Casa da Arquitetura, que não é a mais recente, mas nestas instalações é a mais recente, não é? Que faz 1 ano, e muitos parabéns por 1 ano de tanta atividade e com tantas excelentes exposições. Portanto, passaria a apresentar as pessoas que estão aqui entre nós. Ao meu lado esquerdo, no meu lado direito, na minha extrema direita, está a Olivia Ostfeld-Turner, que já falarei um pouco mais sobre o currículo dela. Junto ao meu lado direito está o Barry Bagdall. Do meu lado esquerdo está o meu amigo Delfim Sardo, o Pipo Chorra e o Nuno Sampaio. Passaria a palavra à Olivia, que agora vou pôr os óculos, isto é um problema, a idade, que vem do Victoria and Albert Museum. Como sabem, as instituições que estão aqui, o Victorian Albert Museum, o MoMA de Nova Iorque, a Culturgest, embora obviamente as curadorias do Delfim estão muito para além da própria Culturgest, o Maxi 21 e a Casa da Arquitetura, são instituições quase todas ligadas à arte ou à arquitetura, ou as duas coisas ao mesmo tempo, têm diferentes dimensões, de diferentes anos. O Victorian Albert, se a memória não me falha, como museu de manufaturas, vem de 1852, algo assim, e portanto, penso eu que será dos maiores museus do mundo ligados ao design, tem 5 milhões de objetos em reserva, o que abrangem todas as áreas, do vestuário até à arquitetura. Tem uma grande coleção em colaboração com a RIBA de desenhos de arquitetura e, portanto, é um museu do Estado, ou pelo menos com filiação no Estado, e eu passaria a apresentar a própria Olivia Ostfeld-Turner, que é curadora sénior de design no Victorian Albert Museum e curadora principal na parceria V&A e RIBA Architecture. Estudou em Cambridge e em Yale, antes de fazer o seu doutoramento na University College London, com posterior pós-doutoramento no Trinity College Dublin. Trabalhou como investigadora de arquitetura no English Heritage e como historiadora com o Survey of London. Ingressou em 2014 no V&A, onde é responsável pela Coleção Nacional de Desenhos de Design, que documenta o processo criativo nas artes aplicadas e na arquitetura desde o século XIV até aos nossos dias. É especialista em História da Arquitetura Moderna Britânica, particularmente interessada nas conexões entre representação e pensamento no processo de design, no processo de projeto, e no papel das representações visuais, incluindo maquetas, enquanto invenção, documentação e comunicação. Tem sido curadora de exposições, designadamente no V&A, na Bienal de Veneza, e no Choban Foundation Museum for Architectural Drawing, em Berlim, além de inúmeras comunicações, publicações e programas audiovisuais, incluindo na própria televisão. Passaria a palavra então agora a Olivia. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada. Thank you. So I'm going to talk this evening about a couple of different types of temporary display that we undertake in the field of architecture at the V&A. Architecture at the V&A, like the building itself, which is an enormous architectural object, is sort of everywhere and nowhere. We have a huge collection of items that is connected to architecture, but it's only very recently that we actually had the Department of Architecture, Design and Digital established. So although we're an old institution founded in 1851 out of the Great Exhibition, we also have a very new life as an architectural institution. And of course, we're representing architecture in the context of all the applied arts. And so architecture becomes just one manifestation of that. The two examples of architectural display that I'd like to talk about, one is very low profile, quite traditional mode of display in our architecture display gallery. The other is very high profile and much larger in scale, and that is our collaboration with La Biennale di Venezia in the Pavilion of Applied Arts at the Venice Biennale. And through this examination of two different modes, I'd like to point to the shift at the V&A that has taken place certainly over the last 15 years and accelerating from architecture as object to architecture as subject. Does this? So these are some of the relatively recent shows that we've undertaken in the temporary architecture display space. And what's very telling about this space is that it was intended principally, when it was designed in 2004, it was intended principally for the display of historic architectural drawings. So you see here the names of some of the recent displays. Now, personally, well, I think one of the things that one needs to note is that the presumption was made in 2004 when the display gallery opened that architecture should be presented and could be understood primarily through a collection of drawings and through images of architecture. Personally, in some respects, I hold with that. I think that drawings, architectural drawings, are things, not pictures of things. But I think the consequence of that focus uniquely on architectural drawings as our temporary display medium has meant that some of the shows have been quite self-regarding, quite self-reflexive. You can see, for example, Designing the V&A, which was based on drawings for the building itself, really was in some ways a navel-gazing exercise. Or we found ourselves quite constrained, and the displays have pulled against the space. So with Mind Over Matter, which was about contemporary engineering, we wanted to introduce a lot of models, and therefore we found that we had to move out beyond the bounds of the gallery. Increasingly, there's been a desire, though, among the curators and amongst the public to present material that has a contemporary relevance, and I think that's really fundamental to all our displays now, and also to provide some sense of an experience of the subject matter. People want to have a response when they look at something and they say, so what? They expect that there's going to be a good answer to that so what question. So, for example, here there are images from ephemeral architecture, which range from 16th century triumphal arches to Michael Rakowitz's project in Chicago, building bespoke homeless shelters from plastic, and Sean Godsell's design for a homeless shelter, and Swiss Studio's design for refugee shelters. And most recently, we've shown Without Walls about disability and innovation in building design, a display which we did in collaboration with an arts organization dedicated to promoting access for those with disabilities in the arts and cultural sector. So you can see actually just there the constraints of the display space with this wonderful case for drawings, but which is pretty much useless for anything else. And so we find ourselves moving out into other places within the museum, which is difficult at the V&A because it's very hotly contested real estate within the museum. This is OMA's cushion for the Maison at Bordeaux, and the film which was produced to give people an experience of moving through the house. And I think we also have made some acquisitions out of these displays. I think it's quite a good test of a successful display if you find that you need to expand the collection in order to bring the display and the collection into line. And we tried to embody the issues that we were addressing through access with sign language and audio description, tactile plans, and touch objects. And as you will be aware, the crisis of availability and affordability in housing is something which is really very hot news in England at the moment, as elsewhere in Europe. And so we have our forthcoming exhibition, A Home for All, 6 experiments in social housing, which is looking at the different ways in which architectural design has been used to suggest solutions. From Alexandra Road by Niamh Brown through to Pshak, a self-build project by Nabil Hamdi and Nicholas Wilkinson. So those contemporary issues are really to the fore of our programming. And it's there that I'd like to just shift to our work at the Venice Biennale. I hope I have still a couple of minutes to go. So here, a photograph by Sandra Lusada of Robin Hood Gardens, the famous, now almost infamous, social housing estate in East Poplar, designed by Peter and Alison Smithson, which was finished in 1972. These very distinctive blocks on either side around a mound, which itself contained the remnants, the buried remnants of the previous housing estate that was on that site. And here we have an image of that block under demolition in 2017, a very controversial demolition after an unsuccessful attempt to list the building and to give it historic protection. So this is an example of redevelopment of a council-owned site into public-private partnership housing, otherwise known as regeneration. And it was at this point, when the building was being demolished, that the V&A voiced its desire to collect a piece of the building, which was what we did. And so we collected a section of each facade and also the interior of one of the flats. The number of homes on the site before were 250. They are going to have over 1,500 homes. So the number of flats is increasing, but questions have been raised about the value of the compulsory purchase orders that were given to existing tenants, the meaning of affordability, and the number of homes available afterwards for social rent. So we set out in the Pavilion of Applied Arts to explore these issues and really to take Robin Hood Gardens as an object lesson. We took the strangeness of having the building fabric available to us, and the fact that we could actually take part of the building that ought to have been in East London to Venice. We took that as our departure point to ask the question, how did this happen? So we looked at the early vision for Robin Hood Gardens, its decline in its reputation, and then its final demolition. And we also asked the question, what can we gain from this? What can we learn? What can we save from the ruin? How can we turn the ruin into a ruin in reverse? And we did this through a series of graphic panels, through film interviews, and through a panoramic 13-meter long projection film by Do-Ho Suh, which was filmed on site at Robin Hood Gardens as the demolition was taking place. And then finally, outside the pavilion, we transported 8 tons of concrete from London to Venice, which was quite a feat of engineering, which Arup helped us to resolve. A building that's a fragment there that's 8 meters high and 5.5 meters wide. it was interesting that amongst the calls for museums to be more engaged with contemporary issues and to deal with issues of relevance, there has been quite a backlash. So when we produced, for instance, this image indicating that the portion of the building that we were salvaging, we then found that there was a meme on social media criticizing our preservation of this piece of the building, saying that we had exploited the situation and that we were effectively stealing a council home, and hence the declaration, the V&A wants a piece of East London. But I think the institutions need to be prepared for this critique. If we enter into the arena of what is relevant, we have to acknowledge that we may be held to account in that way. And I suppose what I'd just like to close with are these two images. The front of Paul Pinder's house, which was a building that was constructed around 1599, that survived the Fire of London in 1666, and that was then demolished in 1890 for Liverpool Street Station. And of course, contrasting that, visually at least, with the framework of the facade of Robin Hood Gardens. So the museum has always been involved in the process of architectural salvage, but the political side of that has never been foregrounded in the same way that it has with Robin Hood Gardens. But I think that these two images are, in some ways, an indication, a symbol at least, of how architecture at the V&A has shifted from being the object to the subject, from being put on display as an object and pointing to architecture in itself as the end, to architecture pointing away from itself towards something else, and therefore acting as a subject. So displaying architecture as a means and not as an end. Thank you.
O nosso próximo convidado a usar a palavra é o Barry Bergdahl, que muitos com certeza conhecerão, que vem do MoMA, que também dispensa muitas apresentações, de Nova Iorque, instituição que existe desde 1929, também com uma ligada quer à arte, quer à arquitetura, com uma larguíssima coleção também de objetos, creio que cerca de 300 ou 400 mil, são centenas de milhares também de objetos, com espólios importantíssimos no seu acervo, além de toda a atividade ao longo dos anos, incluindo as exposições, uma delas já falámos aqui hoje, numa das apresentações anteriores. E o Barry Bergdahl é professor de História da Arte no Departamento de História da Arte da Columbia University, tendo sido o respectivo diretor até à sua entrada no Museu de Arte Moderna de Nova Iorque. É curador no Departamento de Arquitetura e Design do MoMA, onde, entre 2007 e 2013, trabalhou como curador principal de Arquitetura e Design. Mantém particular interesse na história da arquitetura da França e da Alemanha desde 1750. Estuda a arquitetura a partir da história da arte, ainda que ligando-a com a história geral, com a sociologia e com a cultura. Tem trabalhado igualmente sobre a representação cultural em arquitetura, a evolução da arquitetura enquanto profissão e as interseções entre distintos géneros artísticos, designadamente a arquitetura e o cinema, bem como sobre a problemática das exposições museológicas de arquitetura. Além dos inúmeros escritos e publicações, é subejamente conhecida a sua amplíssima atividade curatorial dentro e fora dos Estados Unidos da América, destacando-se, entre as últimas, Le Corbusier, An Atlas of Modern Landscapes, organizada com Jean-Louis Cohen no MoMA e na Cité de l'Architecture du Patrimoine em 2013, e em 2012, recorde-se que desempenhou um papel central para o depósito dos arquivos do Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation no MoMA e na Columbia University, organizando em 2014 duas exposições respectivas, a última das quais Frank Lloyd Wright at 150 Unpacking the Archive, em 2017. Passaria a palavra ao Barry Bergdahl.
Muito obrigado. Good evening, everyone. I think I've segued very nicely from Olivia, my colleague, to a museum which is younger, but which has an older department of architecture, founded in 1932, and therefore perhaps one of the oldest surviving places for attempting to display architecture and design. I'm not going to delve into that history today. I've actually spoken in Porto before about it, but rather I just want to show you a few elements from 3 exhibition projects that I undertook over the decade that I was primarily at MoMA, under the theme of activism and process. Most of the views that you see of museums, like the ones that Olivia just showed you, are taken by museum photographers, quite strangely, never with anyone in the museum. So, which goes forward? This? That one. No. So I just took this one off the internet to show you the place where I work on an average day. Very difficult to admire Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, but also to stand in for the question of how to bring such audiences in to look at exhibitions of architecture. How to engage the general audience with architecture was the question that confronted me a decade ago when I moved to MoMA to take over the architecture and design department. And of course, on one hand, I was very lucky because all these people are already in the building. Some of them are going to accidentally go into the architecture gallery. But then one has to capture their attention and hold it and engage them with architecture. So one of the great difficulties, of course, is we say over and over again that we don't generally display buildings per se, but rather many of the elements that go into conceiving of architecture or representing it ex post facto, like drawings, models, and photographs, but that many times the status of what we are showing is not the same as what is in the rest of a museum like the Victoria and Albert or like the Museum of Modern Art. So this was a question that really preoccupied me when I went to MoMA in 2007. To show you very quickly the first large exhibition that I did, 2008, which was called Home Delivery, Fabricating the Modern Dwelling. It was on the issue of new confrontations with methods of producing buildings off-site, the transformation of the paradigm of prefabricated architecture towards the possibilities rendered by digital production, and the movement from digitally aided design into digital production. Seemed that many people were once again talking about prefabrication as a possible new frontier for architecture. There's a history of prefabrication being the new frontier for architecture. But I don't want to go into the theme so much of this show or its content per se, but I asked myself the question, what would be the status of these objects that I was bringing together? You see here in the large slide, this was an exhibition in 2 parts. This is what points, yes. In the exterior, we brought together 5 prototypes of prefabricated buildings at a scale of 1:1 that could be visited inside and out. And then within the galleries of the museum, we created a panorama of the history of thinking about prefabrication from the 19th century to the present. But the question I want to put forth to you, which was my question to myself, is how do these objects, once on display, not be seen as works of art to be viewed with the respect of a work of art or with the moment of transcendent encounter, but rather as something that could engage the visitor with the thought process of the architect. And in this case, I was interested in what happens when the thought process is to make not a unique object, but a prototype for fabrication. So it seemed to me that the architectural exhibition was caught in a paradox because the objects on display would seem to be static, and I wanted to think how could one create an architectural exhibition that was about process itself. Does this go? There we go. Yeah. So it occurred to me that since these buildings, called Home Delivery as a kind of play on words, stolen from the New York Times because you can have the New York Times delivered to your home in the morning, these houses would be delivered to the museum. And in fact, the activity of assembling the exhibition really was, in a way, the exhibition. So we began the exhibition 3 months before it opened with the demonstration of this site being composed. And it occurred to me, and then inside, very much like this wonderful Brazilian exhibition now, we played very much with film and there was a great deal of overhead film of buildings being produced in factories from Thomas Edison to today, to activate the gallery and remind us that the objects there had all in common the fact that they were produced in one place by means of reproduction and delivered to another. So this active role of film, not surprised to encounter film again here in Porto, as a way of bringing the architectural process onto stage, our theme tonight. But most importantly, I'm going the wrong direction, sorry. There's the inside gallery with the films. It was, of course, a moment when the internet was becoming fully usable, and one had to ask the question, why would you even make an exhibition since you can't actually bring buildings into the gallery? Why not just have an internet, a digital catalog? But I decided that with all these people in the museum, we had a captive audience, but the internet could also be our friend. So this website opened 3 months before the exhibition and continued for many months afterwards. So the exhibition became part of, the physical exhibition became part of the process of thinking of the exhibition as a way of engaging with the nature of design in an environment of fabrication. And what you see here are, on the website, 6 screens, and then here in a kind of Andy Warhol-like way, a live camera on the site where the buildings were going to be. So until the 10 days before the exhibition, nothing changed here. And in each of these windows, each of the people who were supplying a house that was going to be delivered to the museum were posting once a week their activities. And we watched those houses move from office to factory, to a ship in Hamburg, to arrival in the port of New York, to their arrival on the site. And then on the 6th day, the architects rested and the curators blogged about what they were doing there. And finally, 10 days before the exhibition opened, this became a very, very active site. So that was a way of trying to bring a lot of media together to make the exhibition about the process of thinking and to encourage visitors not to think of the building as a work of art to be examined, but to become engaged with the process of its design and fabrication and how the relationship of design and fabrication change the nature of the architectural equation. The second one I want to show you was a project that was actually born in Venice at the opening of the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2008, when the engineer Guy Nordenson, an American engineer, presented to me a body of research on the challenges faced to cities by sea level rise and climate change. And he gave me a lot of kind of Rem Koolhaas style data, research, beautiful graphics, and said, don't you think this would make an exhibition? And I said, no, I don't think we're going to put data on the wall. I know it's very popular, but that's not an exhibition, that's a book on the wall. We were sitting there discussing this in the cafe where all discussions happen in Venice, when the morning newspaper arrived with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York, and I said, by the end of the year, all of the young architects are going to be out of work, they're going to be tempted to become yet another web designer. What can we do? And the idea was born of giving all this research to 5 interdisciplinary teams of architects to think about redesigning parts of New York. Hence, Rising Currents was a play on words, rising young architects with new ideas, but also, of course, the threat of rising waters, giving birth to an exhibition based on this research on the problems of the flooding of New York. I should point out that we did this exhibition 2 years before the famous Storm Sandy raced through the port and flooded large parts of Manhattan. We divided the harbor of New York into 5 zones and invited 5 architects to put together interdisciplinary teams, I said, of the sort you would not find in your office. So don't just bring your soon-to-be unemployed young designers, bring your dream team, landscape people, ecologists, hydro engineers, and these teams were then installed, and here the process thing comes in. 2 months before the exhibition opened, we installed the teams in spaces that Klaus Biesenbach, the director of PS1, MoMA's Contemporary Art Center in nearby Queens, said that he was going to close, and he wanted to know how to close galleries of the museum in order to save money, but not have the public notice it. And I said, give me the keys to those rooms, we'll install these teams. And so they worked in the galleries for 2 months, and we opened it to the public to come in and process, and these are one of the open house days for discussions with the teams, who then, together, public and teams, would finally see the static result of the exhibition on what New York, ways to tackle the future of New York. And I will only show you 2 very quickly. This one, which imagines a green absorptive skirt around New York to deal with sea level rise, but also tidal surges, turning a kind of park-like landscape into a working sponge for water. And perhaps one of the most imaginative, which imagined creating a more textured floor for the harbor, more textured below sea surface in order to break the velocity of sea waves by reinstituting the oyster reefs that had been there into the early 20th century. The one interesting thing about this is a review of the exhibition that came out before it opened. So already the press was engaged with the process of thinking because of these open house days. Now you might ask, given that you are building here an absolutely extraordinary historical archive and a collection, what do these types of activities that I've shown you have to do with the collecting functions of an institution like the V&A or MoMA or the Casa d'Arquitectura? And that was a question I asked myself when we received 2 huge, what we in America would call tractor trailers, what Olivia would call an articulated lorry, arriving. Yeah, it's not only the Brazilians and the Portuguese who speak the same language differently. Bringing to New York the entire archive of Frank Lloyd Wright from Arizona and Wisconsin, some 2 million sheets of paper and models and the like, all to be put on display in time for the 150th birthday of Frank Lloyd Wright, which was just evoked. So the question I had was, of course, would be like, how do you do another exhibition on Amalaro Caesar? How do you do another exhibition on Frank Lloyd Wright? America's still most famous architect. There have been many in New York over the years. There had been one only 5 years earlier. This is, of course, announcing the transfer. And the idea occurred to me in a panic that I needed to put 500 documents of Frank Lloyd Wright and say something new. If you don't have anything new to say, ask your friends and others to come say something with you. And we called the exhibition Unpacking the Archive, which again is a double sense, a kind of double entendre, since unpacking in English means originally to take things like this model of a possible farm. I think we sent this to you, didn't we? Yes, this went to Maxi, but this is actually as it's arriving from Wisconsin, a little-known project by Frank Lloyd Wright, unpacking it into its new home. The archive moves to New York. But unpacking also means, in academic parlance, to discover all of the dimensions of something, to unfold all of the themes that are latent in something. And so from that unpacking idea came the idea of inviting some 14 different people, scholars, museum conservators, scholars often who had not thought about Frank Lloyd Wright before, to choose one thing, like a kind of petite Madeleine chez Proust, one thing in the archive that they found intriguing, and to figure it out by contextualizing it and creating a display with other things in the archive or things that they might like to associate with it. So there's nothing that terribly new that's the way museum curators work, but we wanted to put that process of discovery itself on display. There's the model once it is unpacked. But for instance, I'll just show you one of the 14 episodes. The scholar Mabel Wilson who is a scholar of issues of race and architecture in the United States. Herself, you'll see her in a minute, African American, was stunned to discover that Frank Lloyd Wright had designed a prototype for a better school for African American children in the segregated South of the United States in 1928. A very, very little-known project by Frank Lloyd Wright, and she began to research it and figure out all of its connections in a very, very dense nexus of connections that revealed new aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright, and for her revealed new aspects of her primary research. So, why is this about process? Because we realize the only way for the public to engage not simply with the object, but with the unpacker, with the invited historian section curator, was to film them in the archive. So we started a film project. You can go on YouTube and see these. If you look up Frank Lloyd Wright MoMA, in this case Mabel Wilson, it's just a still here. But we filmed them doing their work, asking questions, and saying how they went, not giving a lecture about the building or the drawing or the model, but undertaking to make clear to the public how an architectural historian works. So I was very pleased with this exhibition because I think it makes a sense of an arc from trying to put the process of architectural thinking on display, and this was the last major exhibition that I did at MoMA during my tenure there, that I would end it by showing how architectural historians and architectural critics think and work with materials, and to make the archive open to the public as a place for asking new questions and discovering new things, the status of the architectural thing, not only as a work of art, but also as the beginning of a possible inquiry. So,
não sei se tens algum. O nosso próximo convidado chama-se Delfim Sardo, está aqui à minha esquerda. Hoje está na Culturgest, que é uma instituição ligada com autonomia, não é? Mas ligada à Caixa de Depósitos.
É uma fundação.
É uma fundação, portanto, apesar de tudo, com dinheiros públicos, sabe Deus, vindos de onde? Porque o banco continua a ser público. O MoMA, esqueci-me de dizer, que é um museu privado, enfim, com acionistas, com um grupo de pessoas que, no seu quadro estatutário, vive é uma instituição privada, digamos assim. Penso que será a única, aliás, aqui a sê-lo. E o Delfim dedica-se desde 1990, como sabem, à curadoria de arte contemporânea, bem como à ensaística sobre arte. É programador de artes plásticas da Culturgest desde 2016. É professor convidado do Colégio das Artes e da Faculdade de Letras da Universidade de Coimbra, foi consultor da Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian entre 1997 e 2003, comissário da representação portuguesa à 48ª Bienal de Veneza em 99 e co-comissário da representação portuguesa à Bienal de Veneza de Arquitetura em 2010. Diretor do Centro de Exposições do Centro Cultural de Belém entre 2013 e 2006 e comissário-geral da Trienal de Arquitetura de Lisboa 2010. Foi fundador e diretor da revista Pangloss e, como também sabem, é autor de inúmeras publicações, colaborando regularmente como ensaísta em arte e arquitetura. É bom de se dizer que a Culturgest é a única instituição aqui presente que não é propriamente ligada à arquitetura, mas mais à arte, embora algumas das exposições tenham a ver com, direta ou indiretamente, com a arquitetura, embora o Delfim tenha, como curador, há muito tempo, uma particular atenção à arquitetura. Passo-lhe a palavra, que estão aqui para te ouvir, não é para me ouvir a mim.
Obrigado. Boa tarde. Sim, de facto, eu não estou aqui, digamos, em representação da Culturgest ou diretamente para falar do que faz a Culturgest, porque a Culturgest, no campo da arquitetura, não tem uma atividade regular e permanente, embora um dos projetos que eu traga tenha sido apresentado também na Culturgest. O meu trabalho fica sempre entre o campo da arte e o campo da arquitetura. E uma boa parte daquilo que eu faço situa-se numa espécie de negociação entre os dois campos, na medida em que as exposições de arte e as exposições de arquitetura têm naturezas muito diferentes. As exposições de arte são exposições nas quais a experiência é a experiência do próprio objeto que está no espaço e o objeto do espaço é o destino da visita do espectador. As exposições de arquitetura, elas têm sempre uma relação que, de alguma maneira, é uma relação diferida com o objeto que está a ser tratado. E essa diferença é uma diferença muito importante quando se pensa uma exposição de arte ou quando se pensa uma exposição de arquitetura, e por isso eu trago-vos 3 exemplos diferentes de exposições, que são 3 instâncias também diferentes de pensar possibilidades curatoriais no rumor destas fronteiras. A primeira é uma exposição declaradamente de arquitetura, que foi feita aqui no Porto, em Serralves, no Museu de Serralves, e depois foi feita em Montreal, no CCA, e é uma exposição sobre um processo que todos conhecem, todos que aqui estão conhecem muito bem, que é o SAL, o Serviço Ambulatório de Apoio Local. É uma exposição que foi feita, que cobria o período de funcionamento do SAL entre 1974 e 1976, portanto era uma exposição histórica, num museu que foi desenhado por um dos arquitetos fundamentais no processo do SAL, nomeadamente no Porto. E, portanto, foi uma exposição que foi muito curiosa de pensar, até porque, e agora a exposição foi feita há 4 anos, era muito interessante pensar o SAL 4 anos depois, sabendo que sobre o SAL ainda existia um enorme investimento emocional por parte de todos os agentes que neles estiveram envolvidos. E é preciso pensarmos que no SAL, entre arquitetos, engenheiros, sociólogos, assistentes sociais e pessoas ligadas às associações, ou, em alguns raros casos, às cooperativas, estiveram envolvidas 1000 pessoas, o que é um número muito grande e, portanto, com um lastro enorme de memória e também de memória afetiva do que foi o SAL. A exposição que foi concebida para o Porto pensava... como é que isto se passa? É assim. 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 A exposição que foi concebida para o Porto era uma exposição que tinha como tarefa, pelo menos foi aquilo que eu estabeleci como tarefa, tentar colocá-la numa distância entre 2 conceitos que eram muito importantes na altura e que vieram a ter destinos também muito interessantes na história do pensamento sobre o próprio processo SAL, que era a questão da distanciação, se quisermos o termo alemão era Verfremdung, portanto a distanciação brechtiana em relação ao próprio processo, e os processos de mimicry, ou de imitação. E estas duas, o balanço entre os 2 conceitos fez-me privilegiar uma exposição que não tentasse ser uma memória emotiva só do processo que foi o SAL, mas que não abdicasse do facto de estar a ser feita num museu para poder ter um discurso sobre o que foi o processo SAL. Houve algumas decisões museológicas importantes, uma das quais foi a primeira decisão que foi tomada, foi a dos projetos serem apresentados em cópias heliográficas. E o facto dos projetos serem apresentados em cópias heliográficas foi uma das decisões mais dramáticas para a exposição, porque fazer cópias heliográficas hoje é um problema gigantesco, não é? Nós tivemos que conseguir convencer um senhor no Porto que tinha uma máquina a funcionar a não fechar a pequena papelaria que tinha durante 3 meses e, portanto, desistir da sua reforma por 3 meses para poder imprimir as cópias heliográficas para a exposição. Mas essa decisão foi muito importante. Havia um ateliê que estava a trabalhar comigo no layout da exposição, que era a Patrícia Barbas Lopes e o Diogo, que colaboraram muito ativamente neste processo e, sobretudo, na segunda decisão, que foi uma decisão muito importante e que foi a de não fazer qualquer alteração na arquitetura de Serralves. Essa decisão foi uma decisão fundamental, era uma decisão muito importante para nós, não haver qualquer enxertia arquitetónica no Museu de Serralves, até porque o museu era desenhado por Cisa Vieira e Cisa Vieira era um dos protagonistas da exposição, portanto, respeitar a arquitetura de Serralves era fundamental na construção da exposição. Esta era uma das poucas salas que tinha alguma memorável e efetiva digamos, do período revolucionário, tinha cartazes de manifestações, tinha banners e tinha imagens, digamos, projetadas que faziam parte do espólio, sobretudo do espólio de Alexandre Alves Costa, que foi uma das fontes principais de documentação fotográfica para a exposição, mas foi também muito importante a decisão de ter uma enorme secura na apresentação dos projetos e apresentá-los em projeto e em fotografias atuais, e foram feitas encomendas a 3 fotógrafos para, hoje em dia, fazerem fotografias sobre os projetos. Os fotógrafos não foram escolhidos, não eram exatamente fotógrafos de arquitetura, são fotógrafos que têm um interesse por arquitetura, mas têm um trabalho autoral e, portanto, esse lado da visão autoral destes fotógrafos sobre o estado em que hoje em dia estão estes lugares e estão aquilo que ficou dos projetos na sua incompletude, foi também muito importante na maneira como se criou essa distância e a passagem do tempo estava marcada. A única intervenção efetiva que foi feita, que era uma intervenção marcante na exposição, era uma linha bege que acompanhava toda a exposição e unificava todos os projetos como uma cinta que isolava a zona onde a exposição estava, digamos, do resto do museu, abdicando completamente de qualquer injeção de emotividade que nós quisemos precisamente não ter. Este era o aspecto das salas, era muito curioso como a exposição... Como a exposição era muito seca e muito abstrata. Está ali uma caixa de escadas, que é a caixa de escadas de São Vítor, do projeto CISA de São Vítor. Era muito curioso, no chão estava marcada a área da habitação de São Vítor e de uma das tipologias, e essa leitura era a única leitura, digamos, figurativa em relação aos projetos. É muito curioso, quando o projeto foi trasladado para o CCA de Montreal, o ambiente teve que se mudar completamente, porque era necessário fazer uma exposição que, partindo exatamente do mesmo material, tivesse uma componente muito mais didática e que, para um público que não tinha vivido a Revolução, tivesse uma quantidade de esclarecimentos que era impossível no Porto, ou que seria inútil no Porto tê-los, e, portanto, a exposição era muito mais carregada de texto, era uma exposição muito mais documental e, num certo sentido, uma exposição muito mais convencional do que a exposição de Lisboa. Este é o aspecto das salas no CCA em Montreal. O outro exemplo que vos queria trazer é um exemplo contrário, que é o de mostrar o trabalho de um artista que era também arquiteto, e foi a exposição de Gordon Matta Clark, que foi comissariada em conjunto por mim e por João Ribas, foi mostrada em Serralves e foi mostrada em Lisboa. As exposições, digamos, seguiam lógicas um pouco diferentes, aqui e na Culturgest, mas houve uma decisão na exposição sobre Gordon Matta Clark, que foi, embora fosse uma exposição, digamos, de um artista, dar um relevo muito particular à componente arquitetónica do trabalho de Matta Clark e à relação que o trabalho de Matta Clark tinha com a sua formação em Cornell e com a maneira como a história da arquitetura do seu tempo se rebatia no trabalho de Matta Clark. E, portanto, a exposição foi uma exposição completamente documental, nós não tínhamos esculturas de Matta Clark, não tínhamos segmentos de edifícios, foi uma decisão de fazer uma exposição mais dura, mais baseada em textos, desenhos, fotografias do próprio Matta Clark e segmentos dos filmes, com uma tónica particular dada a alguns projetos, como os fake real estates, de que este é um dos documentos, o dossiê onde ele guardava os desenhos dos segmentos de terreno que foi adquirindo, a relação com o restaurante Food, a história do Food, era assim que a exposição começava, essa relação vivencial do espaço, o trabalho no Cais de Nova Iorque e a passar a influência que Mata Clark tem de arquitetos cujo trabalho ele conhecia particularmente. Este é o que toda a gente sabe, a intervenção de Mata Clark no espaço onde hoje é o Centro Pompidou, em Paris, mas fazer esta relação com Louis Kahn e a maneira como o mesmo tipo de perfuração no edifício que ele procura era alguma coisa que ele foi buscar a uma relação claramente arquitetónica. Finalmente, muito brevemente, sem grandes comentários, queria-vos mostrar uma questão que é o oposto desta que temos, que é fazer uma exposição de arte que não está a falar de arquitetura, mas que pretende que a arquitetura seja o seu membro fantasma, não é? Aquele sentido de haver uma fantasmática que está permanentemente presente e que vem à superfície, e que foi a Bienal de Coimbra, que era uma Bienal de Arte que eu fiz o ano passado, no final do ano passado, princípio deste ano, cujo trabalho de instalação foi um trabalho que me deu um particular gosto, porque ele teve a arquitetura o rigor do tratamento arquitetónico foi muito grande. Desde as peças fílmicas que foram criadas, como por exemplo esta é uma performance de João Fiadeiro, e isto é o espaço do Centro de Artes Plásticas em Coimbra, e a maneira como foi completamente convertido num espaço para receber a exposição, ou em espaços patrimoniais, como o Convento de Santa Clara, foram as existências que foram utilizadas pelos artistas. Este é um artista brasileiro, o Rubens Mano, que aproveitou uma garagem para fazer a sua intervenção. Ou os sinos da cidade de Coimbra, foi convidado um artista, João Onofre, para fazer um trabalho sonoro que ativava 2 vezes por dia os sinos de Coimbra que se ouviam numa composição que foi composta para o efeito. Ou a maneira como os filmes, este caso é o William Kentridge, se adaptavam ao espaço. Este é um conjunto de quase 600 desenhos do Matt Mullican que estavam expostos numa sala da cidade, que foi um refeitório, ou artistas que fizeram pequeníssimas intervenções no espaço com luz ou pintadas em capelas pré-existentes, ou relações diretas com a arquitetura. Este é um trabalho de uma artista norte-americana chamada Jill Madgett sobre o Louis Barragan e sobre o espólio Barragan, ou, finalmente, como o próprio espaço do Convento de Santa Clara foi trabalhado por artistas cujo eixo foi especificamente revelar o espaço como ele é e como ele estava, em intervenções que tinham esta tentativa, ou então limpar completamente um corredor com 190 metros de comprido e fazer dele uma instalação sonora, neste caso de uma artista francesa, a Dominique Gonzalez Forster. Bom, obrigado.
Eu passaria agora a palavra ao Pippo Ciorra, que vem do Maxi, de Roma. É um museu do Estado ligado à arte e à arquitetura. O Pippo Ciorra é arquiteto, crítico e professor universitário. Desde 2009 é curador sénior de arquitetura no Maxi de Roma. É professor de projeto e teoria na Escola de Arquitetura e Design da Università di Camerino e diretor do programa de doutoramento internacional Villard Doncourt no IOAV de Veneza. É membro do SICA, o Comitê Internacional dos Críticos de Arquitetura, e consultor do Prémio Medalha de Ouro da Arquitetura Italiana da Trienal de Milão. Foi membro do Conselho Editorial da Casa Bella, muitos de nós lembramos-nos dele dessa altura, de 1996 a 2012, mantendo ampla atividade curatorial dentro e fora de Itália, colaborando regularmente com jornais e revistas e sendo autor de inúmeros ensaios, publicações, monografias, abrangendo temas que vão da cidade à arquitetura contemporânea italiana. Muito obrigado.
Grazie. I mean, after this perfect presentation, I think it's time for a messy one. I didn't exactly realize what the discussion would be, how the discussion would go. I mean, and now that I've heard you, I know how should I have prepared my presentation. But in any case, I mean, my friends know I don't care much about curatorship. I like exhibitions. I like doing exhibitions. And I was invited this summer by a Swiss art people organized by the Swiss Institute to discuss in a panel in Palermo, Manifesta. The title was Architecture at the Wheel of the New Exhibition Culture. So I asked myself, wow, are we at the wheel? And how do we manage this wheel? It's time to organize some consciousness. As Barry, I'm not going to speak to you about how Maxi works because I did it exactly on this stage 1 year ago. We are not exactly a state museum. We are a foundation owned largely by the state. And the Maxi gets funded, I would say, 50% by the state, and 50% we have to raise our money with difficulty. I just want to give you an idea of how is this working, for instance. Yeah. I will go through 6, I will not tell you about 6 exhibitions, but I will just tell you about 6 concepts of what we try to do through exhibitions. What you can do and how you can do architectural exhibitions, what kind of protocols and tools you can use to communicate architecture, which is in the end our task. The first case is display. I mean, I have 2 experience on these models, which we did in 2012, and the Japanese house, which was a hit in 2016. Models was done in 2012 when we had no money. There was a crisis in the museum, that there was a change in the management. So I went to my director and said, why don't we just take all our models out of the storage? We put 150 models in the gallery. We organized them, I mean, with some attention, and it was an incredible success. I mean, no, because models excites people. People get interested in, and it really gets trapped in what we'd consider a problem, which is this ambiguity, because they're coming to see the model or they're coming to see the architecture the model is representing. Who cares? I mean, they get interested in both sides. This is a beautiful project by Maurizio Sacripanti, an incredible architect we have the archive for. Barry met Sacripanti about Latin America, no? With the Peugeot project for Buenos Aires. This was a proposal for the Osaka, the Italian pavilion in Osaka, and it was an architecture that was supposed to expand, where there were more people and contract and get smaller when the people would leave. The other experience was very, I mean, super complicated to organize, especially because I found myself in between British and Japanese, and it was the most complicated experience in my life, where I can be an ambassador in whatever country after that. But then we brought all this beautiful collaboration to I think a very nice exhibition, which was a traditional architecture exhibition with a lot of original drawings, a lot of beautiful, which were taken away at the Barbican, the drawings, and a lot of beautiful models, big collaboration with Atelier Bauau, the Barbican, and I mean, this was a traditional architecture exhibition, and the audience, I mean, was very happy with it. There was big attendance. He went to London, he went to Tokyo. It was a beautiful experience. Also, I think a museum like Maxi, but this is probably an issue also in Casa di Architettura, needs design. I mean, exhibitions have to be designed. The space needs to be addressed. I'm an architect. I was trained as an architect. I always think of exhibition in terms of space, because otherwise the Maxi will kill you, no? So this was beautiful exhibition designed by Yoshi Tsukamoto. In the second, I mean, which was actually the first I did, my task was to discuss a process, a design strategy. I wanted to discuss a possible design strategy, so we did it through every possible mean. We displayed objects like this beautiful, the first item in the exhibition was this beautiful records they used to print in the Soviet Union when Western music was forbidden. They would bring the printing machines in the hospitals and they would print the music on used X-ray sheets. Wonderful. So the music on bones, then the Brzezinski beautiful film on Potemkin, I think the perfect recycle project, then photography, of course, or theoretical architecture, or, of course, a lot of real projects that had to do with recycling, so mixing languages and contents. Of course, we wanted to show the process, as Barry said before, so we invited Raumlabor Berlin, we invited 20 students from high school, because I could have the money only if the students were from high school, so the Ministry of Education gave me the money so we could organize this workshop. Everybody went through landfill and places to find materials, and they built a house in the garden of the museum. So the process was actually displayed. This was done when the exhibition was open. I'm not very good with this. Oh, this is not very good. A different case was the importance to display the importance of installation. We did this exhibition, I mean, every exhibition we do has this kind of subtle political issue. Recycle was, of course, both a way to discuss not the ecologic approach, but the conceptual approach to recycle, but also to find a word which would bring people who were not architects to be interested into the thing. Then I did this Erasmus Effect exhibition to make clear to people that the Italian architects are mostly forced to go abroad, most of them in London. And generally, when you put them abroad, they have the same results that the other architects have. So the fact that in Italy there's very little architecture probably comes from general conditions and not from the quality of the single people. We have examples in the room. So I went through the history of the migrating Italian architects, starting from Lina Bobardi to the very young people going abroad today. But then, I mean, it was very different kind of, so I thought that the installation would be important. So I asked Lowtech, a migrating Italian team who been living in New York for many years now, to design the space, to make it clear. And the container, which is on one side their typical material, but it's also the metaphor of traveling, no? Of being shipped around the world. So then I did food, where there was also the Mata Clark, of course, restaurant. Food was the same year of the expo. It was a very open topic. So we were really very interdisciplinary, and for the first time I brought a 16th century painting, a 17th century painting in the museum, because we addressed food through the scale. So we went from body to space to house to city to landscape. This is when I asked Barry from the Frank Lloyd Wright farm. So we had painting, we had photography, we designed. We had an architect designing a tea house, and we had a lady teaching the tea ceremony every week at the Maxi. And I don't know why, but people love this. Although my Japanese friends didn't like very much the tea house designed by an Italian architect. who is also in the V&A collection, but because I mean, this was important because the tatami, no, which is the one tatami and a half is the minimum you need to do the tea ceremony, and then the tatami becomes the size for the space, the house, the word. No, so food again was designing the word, and there was a very famous project by a photographer. There was real architecture. There was the Frankfurt House versus the Comunalca, and many other things. And there were also artists like Minerva Cuevas. Real scale. Berry has already shown, and Olivia even more with beautiful examples. But also for us was important when we did the Japanese house. We thought of the Toyo Ito house, which has been demolished after 20 years of use. So we thought maybe we can rebuild the YTU in the museum. We rebuilt it with 10,000 euros. I mean, they did it a few years before with 100,000 euros in Germany. But then Toyo Ito came. He was really moved by the experience. And so you can show architecture. You can to go through the interior space here was a complete architectural experience. And we were extremely happy we were able to offer the museum audience this possibility within the museum space, no? Not even outside, but in the museum. Maybe the nature of this building and the way it was conceived was helping, of course, in this case, but we were very, very happy. Or we rebuilt ephemeral architecture, and this was an interesting experience we did when we had a YAP crisis for 2 years ago. We decided we wanted to go through this beautiful story, which is this 1970, 77, 78, 79 story of the Estate Romana, this wonderful project, which was bringing art, architecture, theater in the streets in Rome. It was a way to bring the political discourse from violence to culture, and it succeeded. And this was a project by Franco Purini, I will not tell you about, but we rebuilt this scientific theater in the Garden of the Maxi, and it was used for the whole summer for our performance. Then the last, I thought it would be very difficult experience was to display the life of an historian. No? You were talking about, so the idea, how can we talk about Bruno Zevi? It was 100 years that from Zevi's birth. We are not Zevian. I proposed this to the Maxi, then the Zevi Foundation proposed Jean-Louis Cohen, so we were both Tafurian, completely non-Zevian, and we had to discover somehow, or rediscover Zevi. We thought we would we would do something like redesign, restage the studio of the critic, the studio of the historian, with his drawings, with his notes, his newspaper cuts, and so we did. We organized this exhibition in two tracks. One track was this orange line, which was taken by one of the front covers of the beautiful Metron. No, it was a very 1940s scholar. And the whole Zevi memorabilia was displayed on the orange wall, whereas all the work of the architects he would have liked, because Zevi for us was important because through Zevi you discover a number of super exciting, interesting, wonderfully creative Italian architects of the 40s and 50s and 60s that nobody knows, that have been completely shaded by Tafuri for reasons we're not going to discuss today. But so we wanted on one side to tell the story of this crazy guy, polemical, political, also curatorial, because Zevi does 3 exhibitions that are extremely important. I'm sorry, Barry had to listen to all these things already a couple of weeks ago. But then we decided to display also the architects. So on one side we had the orange was Zevi and these panels with a lot of original materials we'd been collecting around archives in Italy. We decided to do the Italian architects, gli architetti di Zevi. And in the end it worked very well. And we also found extremely interesting architecture examples to display. That's it. These were the focus. This was a focus on magazines because ZEBI edits 3 important magazines, Metron, A, and l'Architettura, Cronaca e Storia. And this is it. Thank you.
E eu passaria agora a palavra ao Nuno Sampaio, pedindo para ser breve, porque já vamos mais ou menos numa hora. Nuno Sampaio está desde 2007, se a memória não me falha, à frente da Casa da Arquitetura, e é aqui um dos obreiros também desta Casa Nova, onde estamos, que faz exatamente agora um ano que abriu. É arquiteto, com prática profissional desde o ano 2000, é diretor executivo da Casa desde 2014, se a memória não me falha, certo? Embora a Casa tenha sido fundada em 2007, como eu tinha dito. É mestre em arquitetura pela Universidade Politécnica de Catalunha, onde foi professor convidado em 2002. Tem mantido, como sabem, importante ação na defesa, ou manteve, e continua a manter, na ação e defesa e promoção da arquitetura. Tive a honra de o ter na minha equipa na Ordem dos Arquitetos do Conselho Diretivo Nacional e na altura houve muito trabalho que evoluiu positivamente graças à sua perseverança e à sua ação. É atualmente vice-presidente da Trienal de Arquitetura de Lisboa e presidente da Estratégia Urbana, creio que continua a ser. Tem sido também curador de ações, de exposições, de seminários nacionais e internacionais. Eu quero aqui recordar uma em que participei, portanto, meia culpa, trouxe uma em que participei, que foi a iniciativa Arquitetura Portuguesa, Descrição em Nova Visibilidade, realizada em São Paulo, no Brasil, em 2013, por ocasião, creio eu, da Bienal. Passo-lhe a palavra.
Antes de mais, muito boa noite. Como dizia Vinícius de Moraes, e olhando ali para Zé Miguel Wisnik, aproveitando o adiantado, agora vamos ser curtos. Eu queria fazer uma apresentação, dado o meu perfil pessoal que vem da parte de projeto e sentindo no projeto alguma dificuldade em que a sociedade entendesse o valor da arquitetura no seu dia-a-dia, de ter um pouco de proposta de ativismo, que por um conjunto de sorte que tive na vida, fui juntando algumas oportunidades com que pude trabalhar. Entrei na Casa da Arquitetura logo de início, sócio fundador, e é isso que eu queria mostrar aqui apenas a atividade da Casa da Arquitetura. E há 4 anos tomei, digamos, a responsabilidade da programação e da gestão da Casa da Arquitetura. É uma instituição privada, em que mais de 50% do seu dinheiro é público e, portanto, funciona quase como uma instituição pública. E através da definição, quando encontrei a Casa da Arquitetura, era para mim bastante importante fazer a definição do que eu queria enquanto instituição e o que é que eu achava que era importante no momento, e a partir daí começar a construir um discurso para desenvolver a sua atividade. A Casa da Arquitetura é a primeira instituição em Portugal exclusivamente de arquitetura, coloca na mesma instituição e no mesmo edifício 3 valências, a do arquivo, o tratamento e de exposição, e naturalmente a promoção da arquitetura visava a criação de um centro que pudesse permitir a investigação da arquitetura pelos colegas arquitetos, investigadores, historiadores, e a partir daqui conseguir divulgar a arquitetura interdisciplinarmente também para o mundo inteiro. Havia um compromisso grande, e agora pegando na parte do arquivo, era e sendo nós uma instituição nova, também tínhamos algum benefício de ter alguma leveza, era de um compromisso de guardar e mostrar ao público, ou seja, fazer o debate disciplinar, mas levá-lo ao conhecimento público. E este compromisso ficou patente nesta exposição que nós temos aqui, que é a primeira que nós fazemos a partir de um acervo criado por nós. Já tínhamos um conjunto de bons projetos herdados, até de vários prémios Pritzker, mas era relativamente curto e, portanto, havia a necessidade de começar a criar um acervo e entendeu a Casa da Arquitetura, por proposta minha, a constituir coleções sobre um determinado território, com curadores e, numa determinada época, fazendo um recorte territorial para entender a análise de como se produziria a arquitetura nesse determinado tempo, nesse determinado território e num determinado contexto. Nós sentimos muitas vezes em Portugal, inclusivamente há uma certa familiaridade da população com a arquitetura, ou melhor, mais com os arquitetos com a arquitetura, mas as pessoas acabam por não conhecer o processo de criação dos arquitetos. Logo, pelo tempo que nos dão para fazer projetos, pelo pouco que nos pagam, pela maneira como muitas vezes nos somos, a obra não é respeitada. E, portanto, em primeira mão, o que nós queríamos era fazer esse debate disciplinar, naturalmente, mas conseguir trazer o público geral, que era a população, para que entendesse o percurso, a produção dessa arquitetura e, entendendo que 60% do trabalho de um arquiteto não é construído, era importante guardá-lo, reservá-lo e mostrá-lo ao público para que se conseguisse entender mais dos arquitetos, mais dessa produção arquitetónica. E eu julgo que somos muito jovens, esta casa onde nós estamos hoje permitiu que pudéssemos ser o Centro Português de Arquitetura, já completamos 10 anos o ano passado, mas não tínhamos uma casa que nos permitisse cumprir o nosso desígnio e assim ter uma atividade regular. Fazíamos um histórico, ou tínhamos um histórico de atividades que fazíamos e que nos serviu de alguma experiência para poder avançar, mas só com este edifício é que pudemos nos tornar o Centro Português de Arquitetura. E era para mim bastante importante que a Casa da Arquitetura desse um contributo para construir uma opinião pública qualificada sobre o que é a arquitetura, sobre o processo de trabalho dos arquitetos. Em primeira mão, defini um conceito que vinha já atrás um pouco da minha experiência pessoal, por onde tinha passado, pela Trienal, que foi um projeto onde trabalhei com o Delfim na segunda edição, e que quando fui convidado para fazer uma exposição nessa então primeira Trienal, ainda não estava bem definido até o seu modelo, e a partir, estávamos em Veneza com o então diretor-geral, ou curador-geral da Trienal, e começamos a definir e fomos avançando, e o perfil da instituição foi mudando, e este conceito que eu trouxe para aqui foi um conceito que eu fui formando, que era, em primeiro lugar, trabalhamos num triângulo de influência que tem num dos seus vértices os arquitetos, os técnicos que trabalham na cidade, que colaboram com outros, que economistas. Está aqui referido a arquitetura como pilar central de uma equipa multidisciplinar que o arquiteto deve coordenar, naturalmente. O segundo é o poder público, o poder coletivo, político, que gere bem ou mal o território, de poder central ou poder local. E, por último, a grande população, o grande público, para quem nós trabalhamos, nós arquitetos, para que sofre ou beneficia da boa ou da má arquitetura. E, portanto, este entendimento neste triângulo de mostrar e fazer compreender a arquitetura levava em primeira mão que nós trabalhássemos em dois sentidos. O primeiro, perante a consciencialização do poder público e a criação de políticas públicas de arquitetura, um contributo, pelo menos a isso, e um outro contributo para a criação de uma opinião pública qualificada, trabalhando diretamente com a população em geral. Naturalmente, isso parte do pressuposto que há algum entendimento sobre, e é bom que haja esse entendimento base, mas uma discussão alargada entre a disciplina sobre essa produção. E isso vai ter uma consequência. Em primeiro lugar, o poder, a grande população, entendendo isto e de forma gradual ao longo do tempo, isto tem reveses, de uma forma mais ou menos acelerada, hoje num momento melhor, às vezes num momento pior, e todos nós, toda a vida é feita de ciclos. Esta população vai tendo essa consciência nacional e internacionalmente da importância da arquitetura e, em consequência, vai ter duas ações. Ela própria, exigindo mais dos arquitetos, exigindo mais dos seus técnicos, nos seus trabalhos, no dia-a-dia, nas suas exposições, nas obras que fazem, e, por outro lado, sobre o poder público, alguma exigência naquilo que deve ser a responsabilidade pública da gestão dos territórios e da gestão dos nossos espaços de vida. E, portanto, logo desde o início, nós quisemos vocacionar, digamos, o nosso trabalho para a consciencialização do poder público. E eu aproveito, selecionei apenas só algumas imagens de julho até agora. A Casa da Arquitetura, a primeira coleção que está concluída foi do Brasil. E, portanto, desde que a coleção chegou, foi há pouquíssimo tempo, estamos a falar em julho, quando chegou a coleção, tínhamos já criado uma expectativa e uma estratégia para trazer cá o Primeiro-Ministro, o Presidente da República, o Ministro da Cultura, da Economia, num tão curto espaço de tempo, para verem o que ainda íamos fazer e não o que fizemos, ou seja, antes da exposição. Isto implica, naturalmente, um outro sentido de trabalho junto da população, porque aquilo que nós mostramos são as representações da arquitetura e, muitas vezes, gostamos de trabalhar a arquitetura na sua materialidade, construindo, e vimos aqui 2 exemplos disso, e fazendo a arquitetura no próprio museu para dar uma certa materialidade ao projeto da arquitetura. E trabalhar com a população implica não esquecer um ativismo também sobre o próprio edifício construído. Num futuro eu gostaria que a Casa da Arquitetura pudesse ser uma parte muito ativa no que seja, ou pelo menos um agente ativo junto dos proprietários dos edifícios, desde a classificação e proteção de alguns imóveis, quer como, tendo os documentos, ser parte ativa no conhecimento e na recuperação dos próprios edifícios. E, portanto, isto começa pela valorização do conhecimento público dos edifícios que estão fechados, quando estão fechados ao conhecimento público, que estão, e dando-lhe esse acesso e podendo abrir esses edifícios, porque todos nós temos algumas experiências letivas e hoje, no tempo da internet, todos os alunos conhecem a arquitetura e quando perguntamos se vão aos edifícios, não, conhecem-nos através da internet. Portanto, é preciso valorizar também essa experiência e na maneira como nós chegamos ao poder, à grande população, é esse o objetivo. E depois, como é que isto se materializa, não é? Temos aqui um exemplo de uma construção feita num bairro social, em que se chamava lugar de partilha e que podíamos, de alguma maneira, pôr os arquitetos mais novos, alunos, e os arquitetos mais velhos, os tutores, a partilhar experiências, os arquitetos todos a partilhar com gente que veio ajudar a entender e construir essa arquitetura e, por outro lado, os arquitetos também terem uma experiência prática, principalmente os jovens arquitetos, com os clientes que são hipotéticos, que não são hipotéticos, que são a população desse bairro. E não foi esta relação com o poder e a arquitetura, não foi muito bem entendida logo na primeira exposição, que chamávamos Poder e Arquitetura, exatamente onde se desafiou os curadores nessa primeira mostra de pensar a relação da arquitetura com um conjunto de poderes que eles escolheram e definiram, e depois ter uma programação que trouxesse à casa, num primeiro momento, muitas pessoas de muitas áreas e confrontar com outras áreas disciplinares e com gente de outros territórios, mas essencialmente também nunca esquecer que a arquitetura na ação da casa deveria sair da casa e ter em conta a população. Os números que nós apresentamos, naturalmente face às outras entidades que estão aqui presentes, são números muito pequenos. Tivemos 50.000 pessoas que visitaram a casa num ano, mas é só para servir de referência que quase igual número tiveram as pessoas que contactaram com ações de arquitetura que nós fizemos fora da casa. E, no primeiro ano, logo em 4 países. Ou seja, não contando com esta semana que acabei de regressar de São Paulo, que era importante para nós, que também a partir da arquitetura brasileira que nós guardamos aqui, conseguíssemos valorizar o arquiteto e o trabalho do arquiteto no seu país de origem. E, para concluir, gostaria de explicar apenas uma ideia um desejo que um dia gostaria de fazer uma exposição que ainda não encontrei o momento para fazer, que era construir a exposição, tirar do museu e que a exposição se fosse distribuindo pela cidade fisicamente. Aliás, o Guilherme fez uma Bienal de São Paulo, onde nós participamos, que era exatamente espalhado em vários espaços da cidade, para que a cidade fosse ela própria o palco da mostra da Bienal. E a partir daí fui pensando um pouco nisso, e a minha vontade era que um dia não sequer colocasse essa exposição dentro de portas, mas que ela andasse no metro, que ela andasse na cidade. Ainda não encontrei essa possibilidade de a fazer, mas este era o nosso objetivo. Muito obrigado.
Como já perceberam, eu sou um péssimo moderador, porque o tempo vai adiantado. Ainda bem mais estava a cortar a palavra à pessoa que pediu para eu vir cá, portanto, nunca mais cá venho, com certeza. Mas, apesar de tudo, normalmente, os intervenientes gostam de mim porque eu deixo-os falar. E era importante também deixá-los falar aqui para que pudessem, de algum modo, abordar algumas das temáticas que aqui eram trazidas. As temáticas, ou os 2 temas fundamentais que eram trazidos, baseavam-se, pelo menos no flyer que me foi enviado pela Casa da Arquitetura, baseavam-se num pressuposto fundamental, que era o de que nunca, tanto como agora, a arquitetura tinha tido tanta notoriedade. Portanto, a arquitetura hoje teria muita notoriedade. E eu tendo a concordar, eu próprio, quando fui Presidente da Ordem, falava muitas vezes disso, que há, de facto, tanta instituição, as instituições que estão aqui presentes são exemplo dessa notoriedade. Há tanta escola, há mais arquitetos que nunca no mundo inteiro, há países que concentram enormes quantidades de arquitetos. E, no entanto, por vezes eu sinto que há também uma perda, porque de algum modo ganhamos em pensamento, ou teremos ganho em pensamento, teremos ganho em visibilidade, teremos de ganho no guardar dos arquivos, mas quando pensamos na ação direta, na melhor habitação para todos, em melhor cidade, o que nós vemos é que, por comparação com outras épocas, a arquitetura perdeu poder, ou perdeu território, porque há hoje muito menos políticas públicas, pelo menos aqui na Europa, do que havia noutras alturas. E era o primeiro desafio para os presentes. Acham de que notoriedade estamos nós a falar, que é o pressuposto da nossa conversa, quando falamos? Pode começar a Olívia ou o Barry. Talvez o Barry, que falou um pouco também de... É engraçado que algumas das intervenções falaram exatamente sobre habitação, não é? De uma forma mais nostálgica, no caso da Olívia, com as ruínas do Robin Hood Gardens, não é? O que de algum modo acompanha o que eu acabei de dizer, que estamos a celebrar ruínas do que era uma política pública de habitação em Londres, não é? No pós-guerra, que se estendeu. O Berwickman fez uma das exposições sobre habitação e, portanto, em vez das pessoas hoje em dia irem ver in loco as habitações que se fazem para elas próprias, hoje vão visitar os modelos de habitações que foram pensadas, o que não é mau, mas eu creio que não chega, quer dizer, fica-se um pouco sem saber bem de que notoriedade estamos a falar, porque aquela que eu sentiria como verdadeira é aquela que pudesse melhor servir as pessoas com a arquitetura para elas viverem melhor. Não é? Posso pôr exatamente à discussão esta conversa, ou este pressuposto.
If I could, it's hard to listen and speak at the same time. One of the things that I feel very strongly about in terms of what we were doing with the Robin Hood Gardens exhibit, we regretted the fact that we were able to do that. Ideally, it should not have been possible for us to do that.
I was not criticizing.
No. But we were very heavily criticised, and I think it shows exactly what you were saying, that people want, what is the relevance? And a lot of people said, why is the museum doing this? What good can it do? Over the period that we were working on it, I came to think about it as an ecosystem, like a critical ecosystem, where every different kind of institution works in the way that it can according to its nature. And the nature of the museum is to collect and to display, and ideally also to prompt conversation. And so we were able to collect in a horrible way. It was like collecting a corpse, terrible. But we then did display it, and we certainly prompted debate. And we also, I think with these exhibitions, it's not just about what you put out there, but then how you program around it. So a display is not something that you can just open and then step back from. You need to carry on constructing conversations throughout the time that it's up. And so we had a day-long symposium this summer at the museum about futures for social housing, where we brought together planners and politicians and new practitioners, and we had people debating what actually could come out of that. So I think that the exhibition alone cannot do everything, but it provides a very important focus for other things as well.
Yeah. What do you think, Barry?
I was wondering, since I was listening to the translator translate from your Portuguese into English, and the word that was chosen over and over again was notoriety, and I was wondering if that was the word in Portuguese, since notoriety in English has a very negative sense. And I was wondering if the word was fame or notoriety, but
I think he said popular.
The word in Portugal is notoriedade. But I think it means, for the House of Architecture, for a Casa de Arquitetura, the idea of a very strong presence of architecture nowadays in the world, in terms of the institutions, in terms of the schools, in terms of the architects themselves, and so on and so on. So perhaps the visibility also of architecture.
Yes.
But on the other side, in a way, the architecture, sometimes we feel that architecture is losing their feet in a way, because when we compare all the the dwelling programs we had in the past, or all the things that were done through the cities in Europe mainly, but not only, we realize that nowadays that visibility, or that kind of fame, is strong, but not strong enough to make people and politicians and to do new dwellings, to rethink the city and so on. And so what kind of fame,
Yes. Well, I think there are multiple aspects to this. Obviously, one aspect that is here is the demise of social democracy in the neoliberal world in which we live, and the disengagement of, and certainly not somebody from the U.S. who should be talking about this, but the disengagement of the state from the provision of housing. That's a huge theme, which is obviously interwoven with this. This happened so long ago in the United States that it's almost, too long ago to even evoke the nostalgia that Robin Hood's Gardens might evoke. There's another issue, which I thought I heard you saying, which is one that I thought a great deal about when I moved from the university to the museum as a setting, and that was precisely the paradox that you're talking about, which is that the visibility, the fame of architects, the phenomena that we now claim is over, but I don't think it's true, of the Starchitect, seems to be in an inverse relationship to two things, to the actual power of architects, your book, the actual power of architects in society, in this neoliberal regime in which most of us live, and the other is the presence of architects and the figure of the architect, the face of the architect on very glossy magazines at the same time as, that not that many people really either are engaged directly with architecture or might even understand architecture. So that was the challenge that I thought I was taking on in the exhibition Home Delivery, was how to confront an enormous problem, which is architects are famous, but they're also often thought of as, by the general public, as arrogant, and how to counter that and to actually build respect for the activity of the architect as someone who designs not simply for, but with clients, with society and the like, which is why I became interested in the experiment of, might it be possible to create forms of encounter between architects who explain their work in process and the public, to gain some respect for the act that is in design. And I think also in Nyo's Triangle, how also to convince public decision makers in the 21st century that designers of all sorts, including architects, are not people who are brought in late in the process in order to render a decision attractive, palpable, to give it form, but that the activity of design thinking is itself. I always say I want to show that designers need to be present at the moment questions are asked, not simply at the moment when solutions are being sought.
Yeah. And what's your opinion, people?
Well, I have a few ideas on this. I think architecture is extremely popular, but not relevant today. I think there are a number of proofs. I'll be very simple since my English is rather awkward tonight, but I think 60–70% of the young teams we know, they have never built anything. We know names. We don't even know if they've ever built anything. And in most cases, they don't care about building. I remember a discussion on this stage. They just want to go to the next Biennale. I was talking. I gave a grant to this. I will not tell you who the group is, but it's a Russian group. We gave a grant on research on housing the human, which is a project we're developing in Berlin. I asked this guy, where do you live? He says, oh, I live in Vienna. Oh, fantastic. And where does your partner live? And he tells me he lives in Lausanne. Oh, I say, well, and where is the office? Vienna or Lausanne? Oh, no, Moscow. And then I ask, when do you design? He said, well, when I wake up in the morning, I stay in bed for a couple of hours with my computer, and I do projects. And I was thinking of Carlos Carta. I don't know. No. And I told him, well, I'm not going to look into your architecture. I mean, you can. So I think there is and it's like, there was this cartoon, this comic in Italy, that these guys that were assaulted, were very few, but they were assaulting a fortress, and they were moving around and shooting, so the people would think there were many. No? And architects are a little bit like that today. I think museums have too much powers today. I think museums, I do exhibition as a theory experience. I mean, for me, an exhibition is also a place where I produce theory. But I think too much theory is produced today in museums compared to schools. Schools have very little power compared to what museums are today. I mean, Olivia's discussion was perfect, but I think schools should do a lot of this. Cities should do a lot of this. Everything happens in the museums today. The museum is the only point of view who can look both sides. The museum can look discipline, archive, history, knowledge, and can look presentism, can look the intervention in the city, the ephemeral project I did. So you have an enormous power in a museum, but this power also has the risk to freeze architecture into another of these beautiful topics, not the thing that designs the world, but a topic. I was very happy to do but I have also ideas on this housing issue. I did the Japanese house exhibition because I think it's very interesting the way the Japanese architect, but Portugal is a good experience in this, stays connected with the client, with the people. No? So I think we cannot discuss mass architecture as we did in the 20th century. There is a different relationship between the individual and the mass, and I think the typical social housing process of the 20th century cannot work today. I did the recycle show because I wanted to say we cannot design social housing in a country that has 1 million of empty houses and 3 million of empty buildings. Let's use them. So I think the museum can enter the discussion by I feel the lack of the other people who should enter this discussion. So I think the museum has to do too much by himself, I think.
In terms of
Do you want to
housing,
speak?
in terms of housing, there is a huge importance of the economical side and how housing is financed. So it's not the thing of the importance of the architects themselves, is how does the financing structure works in a country?
The city of Bologna, I mean, it's much easier for me to give you a grant and have you rent an existing empty house rather than build another piece of suburban, depressive thing. No? So this is another issue.
But anyway, it's an economic.
Perhaps in a way we all agree that there is lots of visibility in that a positive one or a negative one, but in terms of relevance, perhaps not as architecture is not relevant as it was in the past. Comparing is it true in your opinion? Because it was what people said now.
I mean, architecture is still the framework that structures everyone's experience.
Yeah, because the idea was with this kind of first thesis that was in the flyer that was given to me. It was the thesis for the questions that were supposed to be answered here. One was how do architecture centers, museums, curatorship, and so on answers to the people? How do you attract people for the architecture itself? And what kind of architecture? And on the other hand, how do you influence decision makers? So how can, in the future, and let me say that in a way, it's true that dwelling is not a popular thing nowadays.
You can do that only if you rent a piano. I mean, the other 165,000 have no power.
That dwelling and the city perhaps are not fashionable as they were. Fashionable, it's perhaps not the right word, but a fashionable theme in a way for many of the museums. Usually they enjoy to think on some other things and so on. But on the other hand, we have to realize that perhaps in Europe they are not, or in USA, but throughout the world they are. Go to Brazil or Latin America, you'll see that dwelling is an issue to be debated, to be thought, and to be built mainly. How can museums and institutions be, because after all, at a certain point nowadays, they are the powerful tool nowadays, in a way? How can they help to influence decision makers and to try to change a little bit? Because it's true that the social democracy or the social policies are not fashionable to nowadays, but it was also true that many times in the 20s and the 30s, architects were working by themselves. They even didn't know who was going to build their houses. So they were, in a way, trying to anticipate the future. And I think perhaps the museums and architecture centers have must have that kind of idea to anticipate the future, to propose things. Do you think so?
I do think so. I think one of the things that I said when I charged the interdisciplinary teams for the project Rising Currents that I showed you briefly was I said we really can't make public policy here, but we can do two things. One, we can create these workshops and get public officials to come and see what we're doing. So we actually created a dialogue by bringing public officials to these workshops. And so, of course, the aura of the Museum of Modern Art means that they actually come. But the other thing is said to the architects, you have to, this is really your chance, because I'm giving you a range of possibility that is not a specific commission. So the museum is a place that actually, in a certain way, takes over some of the lost capacity of the avant-garde to generate discussions about architecture that are free from the market conditions, that are free from what is given, because in the end, a project that's done in a context like Rising Currents is not producing a project, it's producing images. And I often said, you're not producing actually here solutions to the problem, you're producing the capacity of the museum to redefine the boundaries of what the discussion can be about and to bring new people into that discussion so we can get enough press attention that we can try to redraw the contours of the discussion. We maybe can't redraw the contours of the land right now, but we can try to redraw the contours of the discussion.
I'm sorry, Olivia, because I interrupt you.
No, it's just I think the stress that Barry put on process and exposing process, I think, is really important, because so often the general public who don't have a particular background in architecture feel as though buildings arrive fully formed. They're not aware of the consultation process. They're not aware of the contingencies which all have their impact on that building. And so making that clear is a very constructive thing to do, and showing people how those power structures, as Nuno was saying, how those power structures work, then enables people to feel empowered to have to have a voice in that, and to ask particular questions. I think even the way in which we use the term architecture continually, in the research that was done, I know I wasn't at the museum when the architecture gallery was formed, but in the research leading up to that, most people said that they were not interested in architecture, but that they were interested in building. And so it's partly, sure, it's semantics, but it's important. If you say to people, do you care how long your commute takes? They will say yes. If you say to people, do you care whether you can afford to own your own home, still in England, they will say yes. If you say, do you want to be able to live, proximate to other people like you? Do you want to be able to live with people not like you? All of those things we know are architecture. Yeah. But if you ask those questions, people will say, yes, I care about those things. And so then you have to say, well, yes, then in that case you care about architecture. But it won't necessarily be an immediate response of, yes, I'm interested in architecture. It's finding those ways to make things personal, to demonstrate the impact of invisible architectural structures on people's lives.
Did you feel there are more and more people interested in architecture in your exhibitions, for example? How do you deal with that?
In the museum, we're really only able to do displays. There are 2 levels of exhibition at the V&A because it's such a large institution and because it's not just about architecture, it's art, design, performance. So we only do small display levels. And I have to say that the reason that is the case is to get an architecture exhibition onto the roster at the V&A is very hard because you cannot guarantee you will get enough visitors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So,
But I think that the fact that there is more and more people interested in the exhibitions, it doesn't mean that there is more and more people interested in architecture. I'm sorry. And I mean, he's the living proof of this, of the interest that the art world has in architecture today, and vice versa, but more the art world. Sometimes even, how do you say, eating architecture, not taking advantage of architecture. I see this, I live in a museum where I can see this happening very often. So this kind of edgy exhibition or the architect exhibition, it's an item in itself. It doesn't necessarily stand for the fact that that person will go and appoint a better architect for his house the next day. Not at all.
And
It's entertainment, it's architainment sometimes, not in the way Olivia was
is
saying.
it possible to change it? Is it possible to change that or not?
We try, that's why we try every day, but there's also a lot of people who works the other way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we put all their effort to turn architecture into architainment. And it's a very successful process. Too.
And do you think
So we try to do our best. I mean, randomly or not, tonight here you have people who work more or less in the same direction, but there's a lot of people who has a different approach to this issue.
Of course. And Delphine, anything to say?
No, I think I wanted to say something about that relation between museum and academy. And you were saying that lots of things museums are doing, academies should do it.
Yeah.
Which is true. But the thing is that museums have, they can much more faster renegotiate their protocols.
I know, I agree.
And we profit from that. We try to use that capacity of museums of permanently renegotiating its status, the protocols of showing, the protocols of communication with audiences, and yes, but for sure, that has another problem, which is putting too much weight on the representation that museums do. And museums cannot have an excessive weight of representation on their shoulders, or else they will lose the voice and they will try to be sensus communis, so they will try to please everybody, and that's the big problem, I think.
but that's the paradox that museums are facing. The paradox that museums are facing generally is that people want museums, or people have built museums as a source of authority, but they also want to kick against that authority, and they also want to have a part now in framing that authority. So we increasingly find, I think we're moving more towards doing collaborative projects, but that also changes the nature of the authorial voice of the museum. But that's definitely one of the tendencies that we're now encountering.
Eu creio que
Nuno, queres dizer alguma coisa?
o desafio é um pouco o Barbero falava da capacidade de poder ampliar o debate e o limite desse debate, mas também a capacidade que nós teremos ou não teremos de envolver os outros elementos deste circuito, deste triângulo, que seja, e trazê-los ao debate. Eu acho que o grande desafio, naturalmente, dos museus hoje não é darem soluções, não é apresentarem soluções. Alguma investigação é, naturalmente, os museus e os centros compartilham essa possibilidade com as academias, mas, essencialmente, o grande desafio é a capacidade de envolver demais nesse debate, de ir à sociedade e conseguir que a sociedade venha debater ou pegar num tema e conseguir alargá-lo à sociedade. E eu acho que esse para mim, neste momento, é o desafio que se nos coloca, de diferentes maneiras, diferentes escalas.
Talvez seja a altura de perguntar à nossa resistente Assembleia se alguém tem alguma pergunta a colocar aqui aos nossos convidados.
We're hungry.
I know, we are all angry. Yeah, I know. But you have your time.
Bacalhau.
Não sei, Guilherme, que estás aí na primeira fila, não sei se tens alguma pergunta a fazer. Uma só, porque já percebi que também a hora vai larga e a discussão teria muitas pernas para andar, mas de qualquer forma, das várias apresentações que tivemos, das várias instituições, foi possível pelo menos abordar direta e indiretamente aquilo que estava aqui em jogo, não é?
Also a tribute to the audience because
Yeah,
they
yeah.
stayed here so long.
Yes, of course.
Grazie.
Eu já percebi que o Pipo quer encerrar a conversa. E porque a hora vai lá. E provavelmente será a melhor altura, são 9 menos 10, e não tem ninguém para perguntar. Deu por encerrado o debate. Muito obrigado.
We go debate the table, no? At the table. Grazie.